And finally, we can start today's session. I can already see that it is a very stimulated session because we have questions before the presentation. So I really look forward to that. So let's go. Let's start now without further ado, because we're already still Galia's 5 minutes of her presentation. So good afternoon, everyone. This is our Creature Research series. I'm Wesley Ling. I'm Professor of Transcultural Arts and Design from the School of Art, Architecture and Design, and the Director of Creature. So welcome you all on board. And just to remind you that we are recording the session, so we will record for you. And you would find the recording following today's event on our Creature website. And also please put yourself mute to prevent any intervention with the signal. As I explained earlier, that the chat box unfortunately doesn't work. So we could not collect your questions along the line, but we will have dedicated time for questions at the end. So you have a chance to speak and also exchange your opinions as well. As part of the research series on monuments, on performance, monuments and public spaces, today's event is initiated from one of Creature's research strengths, public space, organised and coordinated by Dr. Yasset Lewis-Scarzo. In the past months, we had 3 engaging seminars, one on revisiting counter monuments by Dr. Ruth Fazacali at the University of South Australia, Festival Cities by our colleague Margaret Goh, and Performative Monuments by Dr. Matthew Rivage from the School of Art Institute of Chicago. Lots of interest and dialogues have been generated with these sessions, with which I've also noticed that they have now grown organically. You will find more of these sessions under this series in the months to come. Details on the full program of other seminars and also sessions can also be found on our Creature website. The Monument Series organizer, Dr. Scarzo, will be chairing this session, so in a minute I will shut up. Dr. Scarzo is reader in art and performance at our School of Art, Architecture and Design, also Creature's Deputy Director. I would like to pass on to Dr. Scarzo to introduce the research series, and most of all, our speaker today, Phil and Galia Kollectiv. And thank you for taking part in our event, Galia and Phil, and a warm welcome to you both. Without further ado, over to you now, Yachts.
Okay, thank you so much, Wesley, and thank you everyone for joining us today. And I'm so thrilled that we can continue this really exciting series of events talking about kind of really interrogating this notion of monumentalism in all its forms and specifically in all the questions that it generates. So today I'm really delighted to have Galia and Phil Kollectiv who are going to present their concept of kitchen table monumentalism, which will also draw on their practice, and I'm just going to give you a few details on their work, reading from their bio from our webpage. So Phil and Galia Kollectiv are London-based artists, writers and curators working in collaboration. Through their performance, film and sculptural installations, they have been interrogating the organisation of labour and the manifestations of ideology in late capitalism. They have had solo shows at Centre Clark Montreal, Te Tui in New Zealand, and Showroom Gallery in London, and presented live work at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, Berlin Biennial, and Kunsthal Oslo. They're the directors then of artist-run project space Xero Klein and Coma, and work as lecturer in art at the University of Reading, the Royal College of Art, and here at London Metropolitan University. So what we're going to do today is we're going to, first of all, hear Galia's and Phil's paper presentation, and then after which there'll be plenty of room for questions. So we absolutely want these sessions to be dynamic, to be discussion-led. And yes, so thank you very much, Galia and Phil. So ready when you are.
Thank you very much for the invitation. This is a very exciting series to be included in. So for today, we'd like to talk you through a couple of projects that we've done in the past that address the monumental in some respect. But we'd also like to talk about the challenges that the current situation with coronavirus presents for any kind of public intervention along the lines that we've done in the past. And we've been looking to other models of thinking through publicness for some time now. So we will be talking through some historical examples and contemporary examples of work not by ourselves as well. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen so we can look at this PowerPoint, see some slides. We've not included any videos, so if you are interested in watching anything that we're referencing, there's a link at the end to our website and you can look at further materials there. This is just in the name of brevity. So here we go. Just going to go into this. Yeah, okay, good. So yeah, we grew up in this neighborhood where there was this sculpture representing the boats saving the Jews in the Holocaust in Denmark. And we did a project in Israel a few years ago and took some performers from London with us. And they just noticed how many monuments were strewn everywhere in the landscape. Everywhere you went, there were these sculptures, representing these kind of grand narratives of Zionism. And we hadn't really thought about it until that moment, but we think they really did shape our consciousness in some way. For at the same time, we were kind of observing that in London, these monuments to the prevailing ideology were completely absent. So, you know, where in Israel, we had grown up indoctrinated, you know, you'd have lessons in school explaining the state ideology to you. It seems that the kind of neoliberal late capitalism that dominates today here is far less overt in its operation. And we thought that was an interesting absence to kind of explore.
So, yeah, going back more than a decade, we started thinking about those problems of how to make the missing ideological component of late capitalism present. Following a visit to Venice, I think we were more impressed with the yachts moored outside the Arsenale than the actual art on display that year. And we thought that as structures, like yachts themselves seemed quite interesting in thinking through that tension between the public and the private. They're massive public objects. They stand right in front of you, almost as monuments, and yet obviously they're private property, and their interiors could never match the kind of grandeur of what they look like on the outside. So we started playing with those ideas and kind of developed, you know, a way in which we always often work is to start from collages and then kind of move towards other realizations of projects. This in particular led to a later performance in which we have used the shape of the art to perform a kind of almost like abstracted state ritual, erecting a monument, a future monument for our own time, for late capitalism, using kind of using sort of like ephemeral materials. So it's not cast in concrete in this case, but made from foam, but nevertheless, it was a sizable public monument, albeit a temporary one.
So we became quite interested in the idea of the temporary monument and the future monument. We realized we would never be asked to produce official ideological objects by the state, nor did we identify with these. But it interested us to play with this idea of over-identification with state ideology, to kind of give this ideology the face that it didn't want to present to us, to make it present in the space. And we've become increasingly aware of the kind of decline of public space. Long before the COVID-19 situation, public space had been shrinking. Spaces that used to be kind of the commons were increasingly commercial spaces. So it was actually difficult to even find occasions to do something like this, but we were invited by this biennial, and we thought there was something interesting about the temporary future-oriented monument in terms of kind of playing with these timelines of monumentalism. So where a monument is meant to be literally a memento, a way of commemorating a past event, we were interested in producing a monument for future events, and a temporary one of that would produce a kind of image, an intervention in the space, not necessarily a lasting kind of object that people would have to engage with on a day-to-day basis. And we thought of these along the lines of what the artist David Burrows has described as performance fictions. So it's something that you perform in order to kind of fiction into being. And I think this is an interesting contrast to the current discussion about tearing down monuments. It was always important for us to at least be able to imagine taking a position of power rather than merely presenting the kind of marginalization of the oppressed. So we didn't want to just tear the monuments down. We wanted to build new monuments for a new society that would perhaps follow our own, where the current ideology would be something remembered. And although this society is yet to come, the idea was to kind of project it into being by performing these gestures. And the people in the photograph you are looking at there was also a manifesto that was read out loud, so it's part of a longer performance with music of the construction of this future monument.
This was, again, started from a collage for a slightly different project, but kind of returning to the same themes. We started thinking about the language, the kind of abstract algorithmic language of financialization, and trying to imagine how to literally make it concrete, capture it in concrete, making it slow, dumb, and sort of like to give it a form or shape. So this led to a project we did a few years ago at the Hayward Gallery, where we've constructed this concrete sculpture / monument / stage. It was kind of in between a stage to perform on and a kind of monumental sculpture made of concrete that stood in the gallery rather than public space, but we thought of it as a model that could be used for sort of public sculpture too. And the idea was to kind of try and see what happens when we make ideology present in the space again, rather than trying to evade it or ignore it. We wanted to, as I said, kind of make it present, slow, dumb, just kind of quite bulky. The same logic we applied to the performance. So in this image, you can see sort of temporary band that we formed with two other artists. And we've invited other musicians too, to try and take one of the songs that we remembered from our childhood, one of the school songs that we heard quite a lot, a song that was a Zionist song, Zionist propaganda song from the 1930s, which contained the line, kind of in rough translation, calling for the workers to dress the state in a concrete gown, as a kind of, as the realization of the kind of dream of Zionist progress and the conquest of nature. And we were really interested in seeing how other people, kind of, British or European musicians might respond to those lines. What ideology from the 1930s, from a different context, would feel like now. What kind of aesthetic can we imagine around the expression of this kind of sentiment?
It's almost as though in the absence of a language for the ideology of today, we need to borrow from the ideology of the past, this kind of utopian modernist nation state fantasy of clothing the desert in a gown of concrete and cement. We need to resort to that language in order to start to even find an aesthetic language that can talk about today. So that was the kind of premise of this project, and it resulted in 5 different performances on this kind of monumental stage. And again, there's a juxtaposition here of this kind of heavy brutalist aesthetic with the lightness of not only the kind of financial flows illustrated by the graph, but also the fact that the concrete is a thin skin over a kind of wooden structure that goes in the bin at the end. So again, a kind of temporary, future-oriented monument. Now, this type of practice has ground to a complete halt. Oh yeah, before we kind of move on to the next thing, I wanted to kind of show you this image of a performance piece by OHO, the formerly Yugoslav performance group, becoming Mount Triglav the national symbol of Slovenia. And that's Mount Triglav itself. And this is a kind of very brief performance, you know, taking the photograph, but it becomes a kind of important moment in East European performance history. And we were interested in the possibilities latent in this idea of the kind of temporary monument as a gesture, something that can immediately disappear, and how that functions, particularly in a kind of repressive context where you don't necessarily have control of public space. You're not necessarily invited to do this kind of thing. So this type of intervention was kind of inspirational. But all the while we were thinking about these things, we find ourselves in a situation where not only is the public sphere is increasingly kind of constrained, but also we're literally not allowed outside. So that kind of exacerbated, like with many things, I think coronavirus has only exacerbated processes that were underway, but it led us to think more kind of acutely and intensively about the relationship between public space and the private spheres. So one text that we went back to, as many have, was Hannah Arendt's The Human Condition, because Arendt was trying to define this kind of relationship between the public realm and private space, and she was very concerned about their kind of blending together in kind of modern configurations of society. So Arendt writes, and I feel like this is incredibly prescient in a way, the presence of others who see what we see and hear what we hear assures us of the reality of the world and ourselves. And think about like the past year where we've not really had access to a shared reality in so many ways, and how this comes after a few years of, you know, like fake news, and how do we know what's real, and the kind of rise of the inexorable rise of the simulacrum and all this. So yeah, it feels very apt. And she writes, while the intimacy of a fully developed private life, such as had never been known before, the rise of the modern age and the concomitant decline of the public realm will always greatly intensify and enrich the whole scale of subjective emotions and private feelings. This intensification will always come to pass at the expense of the assurance of the reality of the world and men. So she recognizes that, you know, the kind of development of the idea of intimacy and private life, you know, has a lot of advantages. It kind of expands our scale of subjective emotions, private feelings, but it's at the expense of the assurance of reality. And yeah, I just feel like this is a very interesting description for the present.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, Hannah Arendt is concerned with the erosion of this, what she sees as a kind of an important dialectic that we have to preserve between the private and the public, that she sort of traces back to Greek culture, and she makes some kind of relevant points, but I guess a way of looking at this would be through, I suppose, the kind of dominant cultural forms of of the period. So I suppose with the rise of liberalism in the kind of 19th century, we have the book or the novel, which is a little parcel of private space and time, a world that kind of is created only between you and the pages, but is still kind of shared, discussed, and kind of distributed in a sort of liberal discursive space. But in the 20th century, the kind of age of mass mobilization and collectivization, maybe you have the cinema, which is a space shared temporally and physically by many hundreds of people who, as Eisenstein noted, actually feel the same feelings, go through the same motions all together, and that produces something. And now, I guess you could say that the dominant form of our time is this kind of weird hybrid of sort of privatized collective worlds, gaming platforms, sort of social media platforms, YouTube videos, where you do have some sense of kind of opinion making and kind of discourse making, but the experience is very much isolated.
So on the one hand, you know, we could decry the loss of kind of Arendt's notion of the political. Sorry about the meowing, the cat doesn't like this idea either. So, you know, Arendt thinks that the domestic should be very much separate from the public. The world of the oikos should not be part of where politics is generated. That's the kind of Greek model, and there are problems when we start to blend these things. And I think we see these problems in the intensification of the extraction of value from the private individual, the fact that within kind of post-Fordist organization of labor, our very being, ourselves, is, you know, mined for value. So in order to perform our work, we have to be ourselves. We have to produce affects. We have to produce judgments. You know, we have to tweet certain things that are in line with what our employers want us to tweet, etc., etc. You know, so there are these kind of problematic blendings. But at the same time, I think it's also problematic to be nostalgic for a kind of clear separation between the public and the private. In the wake of a lot of protest movements over the last decade, kind of taking to the streets, there's been a lot of, I think, very important discussion about who gets excluded from those moments. So, you know, going all the way back from Occupy to Black Lives Matters and Extinction Rebellion, etc. As one example, oops, there's an extra comma there, but yeah, Johanna Edwards' sick women theory. She writes, if we take Hannah Arendt's definition of the political, which is still one of the most dominant in mainstream discourse, as being any action that is performed in public, we must contend with the implications of what that excludes. If being present in public is what is required to be political, then whole swathes of the population can be deemed apolitical simply because they are not physically able to get their bodies into the street. So speaking as somebody with a long-term disability, long-term illness, chronic illness and disability, Hedva stresses that, you know, she's not able to participate in that way that Arendt would like to see in politics. But maybe there's a problem with how we define publicness in politics then. And I was thinking about, you know, simple things like when there were a lot of protests happening and my grandmother was sympathetic but not able to be out on the street. And I kind of thought, okay, for whom is this? If you can't have any caring responsibilities, if you need to be able-bodied and young, you know, maybe there's a problem with that model too.
And maybe one last point to add, although, you know, we shouldn't dismiss the brave and amazing attempts to retake the public sphere as a political site by political movements. Since 1968, really, we've seen an increasing encroachment of the ability to organize in public spaces through kind of aggressive architectural solutions, through increased securitization and kind of military tactics used to police public spaces, and through literal privatization of a lot of kind of common spaces in cities. So in other words, we find ourselves at a point in history where even when we do go out to public spaces and try to kind of use them as kind of to make demands, these spaces resemble more and more kind of militarized zones. And therefore, I think we need to kind of think of a politics that kind of goes beyond the division of the private and the public.
So the last section of this talk will be almost like a mood board of inspirations of things that we're thinking about as interesting approaches to rethinking this kind of relationship between the public and the private, or complicating this dialectic. We'll show you just a few of these. So one kind of movement that we've been talking about a lot has been the Apptart movement, which operated within the Soviet Union under conditions that were, you know, repressive in many ways. You couldn't exhibit art, you know, that was not in line with the kind of official regime's idea of art, and therefore a lot of artists ended up making art in private spaces, in apartments, hence Apptart. As for example with this example, with this slide, where the fridge becomes a novel. And we were interested in this kind of domestic space usage and how that kind of played out. Don't have time to expand on it too much, but a lot of that art took place as a private exchange between artists, basically trying to impress each other, or through mail art networks, clandestine presentations of art that have somehow survived beyond their kind of immediate time and use, and we're interested in the possibilities of that.
And similarly, this is by the Russian artist Yuri Albert, who in the 1980s kind of performed these series of performances, helping with the housework, in which he literally went over to various houses of people, strangers and also people he knew, and helped them with various kind of household chores and documented the work. So this was a very private, almost secret gesture. And what's interesting about this is that although at the time of the performances perhaps for only the camera or maybe one or two other people, it definitely assumes a kind of future audience or future use for those gestures. So it's a kind of private, so like things that happen in private that kind of imagine a publicness to come.
It's also interesting to contrast this with Müller Euclid's maintenance art, where, you know, the domestic labor is put on display in the museum. So kind of exhibiting that labor publicly in a public space. Here the work isn't explicitly exhibited, but of course the fact that it's being performed by a male artist is kind of significant in kind of questioning that relationship between different types of labor too.
This is so this is another example. So kind of one cluster of examples comes from beyond the Iron Curtain, where a lot of people, a lot of artists sort of had to withdraw to public spaces and try and kind of preserve an artistic community without using public institutions for various reasons. Another cluster of examples come from, I suppose, feminist practices of the 1970s and 80s. Where often women artists challenge the notion that art has to be produced in, let's call them traditional modern spaces of production, the artist studio. Often they didn't have access to those spaces, and as did you know, kind of like people who are not able-bodied. So those spaces that assume kind of dirty spaces to make sculptures from metal or wood, or even painting, spaces that are the accumulation of kind of matter. If you're in a position of care, you might not have those conditions, and you might be kind of like, you might produce work at home on the kitchen table. So these artists, rather than kind of like go out and sort of like try and insert themselves into public spaces for consumption and production, formed alternative networks of distribution and production. They made work often in domestic environments and shared this work through an elaborate network of mail art. They sent each other works, commented, collected things, and eventually those collections reached, had a kind of more public output. This particular example from Sue Richardson is interesting because it's, on the one hand, it's sort of, it's a crocheted burnt breakfast. So it's an image of a kind of unloved domestic chore. It's kind of labor done without care. On the other hand, obviously, the crocheting itself is quite a difficult and kind of time-consuming activity that has to be done carefully. So there's this kind of nice, kind of ironic relationship, I suppose, between the art, what it presents, and kind of the way it's realized.
We also wanted to include Sona Beckovich's triangle as an interesting gesture that kind of traverses the public and the private. This, by now, quite famous piece, Beckovich is masturbating on the veranda on a day when all citizens in Yugoslavia were told to stay indoors for Tito's visit. And
all wave flags on the street.
Yeah, and she chooses this space that is neither staying indoors privately nor going outside waving the flags, but kind of this in-between space, knowing that she'll be seen by the surveillance person on the roof. And of course, she gets a knock on the door a few minutes later, kind of showing the success of this intervention. So she's told to stop and either go inside or wave a flag. Interestingly, she repeated this performance in the 2000s and nothing happened. And she was interested in that too, like how surveillance kind of changes and how power operates slightly differently in conditions of so-called freedom. But we think there's something about this intervention that's kind of relevant to this interrogation of public and private space. More recently, as Yachts mentioned, we run an art space, Zero Plan and Coma. One of the exhibitions that we put on in the gallery was by an artist called Yachts, and she was interested in the Pearl Roundabout in Bahrain, which you can see here. It was torn down after it became a kind of site, kind of focal point for protest. But what was interesting about it was these kind of homemade versions of it started cropping up, and Katya collected all the different ones and reproduced them.
So people used to kind of produce them from cardboard at home, so like almost like little guerrilla monuments, and then go out in cars and in the middle of the night just dump them in public spaces. So there's kind of a reminder, the memory of that monument that got torn down, and it's kind of interesting that the original object had no particular meaning. It's just like a kind of fairly bland sort of like 1960s modern object, but then it took on that kind of extra dimension. It became a symbol of resistance.
So these are kind of DIY monuments. We want to end on one last example, if you permit us. I'm kind of conscious of time. But Sankyo, who was one of the artists who performed with us on that concrete stage, made this video as part of the Transmissions series, I think it was this year, last year even. And it's called If You're Reading This, Get Ready to Meet Me in Your Dream Tonight. And it followed a series of exchanges on social media talking about infiltrating people's dreams, and then the video kind of explores this. What I found interesting was that at a time when we were socially distanced, we couldn't see our friends. By inserting this suggestion into the kind of quasi-public conversation on social media, sound literally could get into people's dreams, because if you read it enough times, you may well dream about it. And I was interested in the way that that kind of breach of the private space of dreams could take place through this vehicle. So I think, you know, there's a lot that's problematic about social media and the way it's functioned, particularly in recent times. But I think there are some interesting subversions of this that may yet be exploited to produce interventions like this. So that's what we'll end on, and hopefully we still have a little bit of time for discussion before we'll need to disappear. I'm going to stop sharing the screen now, but oops, last thing, if you do want to see anything, this is the link.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Galia and Pil. This is a really interesting topic, and I'm so pleased, by the way, that we are able to get perspectives such as yours and the combination of different perspectives. In fact, incidentally, yesterday, our sister centre, Cube, Centre for Urban and Built Ecologies, was hosting a talk by Vivian Lovell from Modus Operandi, former Director of Public Art Commission Agency, and also there we were interrogating this idea, the difference between the different framings of monuments, and of course the implicit problem between what we define as public space and as public sphere, and the relationship, as you suggest, also you know, all these definitions, all these phrases are inherently problematic. Public space, public sphere, and as you then add, of course, public institution as well. In a sense, yes, a public space could be in theory public access, but of course we know that that's not the reality for many people. And equally, the public sphere, the supposed public sphere that, for instance, we get from social media, can be anything but, in fact, you know, it's a testament to democracy. Talking about that as well, and I just wanted to inform the public that we've got a newly added event as part of this series, and this will be on the 22nd of April by Dr. Tanja Schult from the University of Stockholm, and she's going to specifically interrogate the idea of monuments. So the session is called Monuments and Democracy, a Paradox of Fruitful Combo. And so she'll be interrogating this particular idea. And I think Tanya's with us today, by the way. So so feel free to say something more after. But I'm going to open the debate now to our guests. Does anybody have a question that you wanted to ask? I'm so sorry. I think I've just disappeared and reappeared again.
We're back.
Yes, I think maybe for a lot of us this happened. I got logged out. Did you get logged out as well?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So maybe other people there. Well, there you go. Talking about public space, a perfect example of this. Right, we've got a question. So Professor Nicholas Temple, there's a question.
Hi. Thank you very much for your presentation, which I really thoroughly enjoyed. I've just got it's a slightly off the wall kind of question, I suppose, but it relates to Arendt's point about this relationship between public political space and private space, and it partly relates to kind of research that I've done. I'm an architect, but architectural historian, and there's a really interesting book actually on the public, basically on the public dimension of friendship in the Renaissance. And it talks about something intriguing. We think of friendship as a kind of intimate private affair. And yet in the early modern world, the notion of friendship was in every sense a public declaration. And they really didn't exist in the way that we would understand it, this idea of the private. It was more to do with degrees of public rather than degrees of the private. And it was most clearly demonstrated in this idea of friendship and how it manifested itself through everyday activities, but also interestingly, taking this idea of the classical polis model, where the idea of even the this declaration of friendship was manifested through the projection of the natural voice, you know, without any other forms of amplification. So in other words, you know, public spaces only worked if the voice could be carried to a point where it could be attuned and listened to. So this idea of communication was very much a kind of physical affair, and actually how that manifested itself through the civic dimensions of life, whether it's to do with artists and their patrons, you know, humanists and lovers, you know, mercantile activity. There were different kinds of friendship that actually happened, which we wouldn't necessarily assume to be friendship in the modern world. So I'm kind of interested in a way, the kind of way in which artwork deals with this idea of the public realm, but also in the context of what we describe as forms of human interaction, about this idea of the stranger versus the friend, and how that manifests itself in the public world.
I think it's a really good question, and I think so much contemporary art follows the kind of trajectory from happenings through relational aesthetic to this idea that art needs to be participatory in order to be somehow representative of democracy, or, you know, some kind of idea of the political as progressive. But I think it's important to remember that contemporary art ultimately gets archived as an image and is seen primarily as documentation, even when it takes the form of that kind of interaction. So I think there's a kind of false idea of realism embedded in that notion of participation. Like, you know, if you've done something participatory, you've done something more real than if you'd made a painting. But ultimately, both things get carried through as images that may have real consequences, because images are, you know, exist in the real world and have real consequences, as we can, of course, demonstrate in many cases. So I'm kind of interested in the way that the performance gets played out as an image that can function in this performative way that I was describing earlier in the context of David Borah's writing, or Borah's and O'Sullivan, as plastique fantastique. They talk a lot about performance fictions, following Austin's idea of performativity. So I think even if you do something that is live with an audience, its potential is in what it represents as much as in what it kind of physically does to an immediate group of people. And we can see that with the way that Apptart kind of lives beyond its time, this documentation that we're talking about now. So it might have been really meaningful in a different way to the people participating then, but it's doing something now, and I think that's important too.
Yeah, maybe we can also add that the problem is that for Arendt is that that social space of political, you know, she defines the politics by rhetorics rather than action. So it's talking about things and convincing people, and that talking about things has to sort of like exclude labor. So this is why slaves and women cannot participate in the political, in the polis, in the Greek polis, because so all of economic activity is private in that setup, whereas the citizen is liberated to deliberate, to participate in kind of decision making and take action if necessary. And that is obviously a problem that you know, from kind of capitalist manufacturing onwards, like you have a kind of collective making, so like 10,000 people in the Fiat factories. So it's like that boundary collapses. And we kind of, so, you know, this is why we think we need to kind of like rethink those parameters completely, of that kind of dialectics between public and private, and maybe I don't know. I mean, you're absolutely right that there are maybe more kind of other historical models that are really interesting we need to go back to. I guess what Galia said about kind of images and how they function, it kind of made me think of during the kind of French Revolution, just before the Jacobin Terror, David producing that famous portrait of the murdered Marat. But that painting was paraded as a kind of fairly kind of raucous and violent so demonstration through the streets of Paris. It was a political event in which an image was the kind of leading participant in a demonstration, and painting in that sense was kind of a sort of private bourgeois object, you know, usually on walls rather than in public spaces, but that was taken from the private into the public and back into the private.
So going back to the point, Galia and Pill, that you made about the monument, you know, again, it's such a difficult frame, and it seems to me the more we look into monuments, the more I see it as a framing concept rather than a definition of something, a clear-cut definition. And I find very interesting your point about the idea of that monuments can be not necessarily something that looks at the past, but it could be something that looks at the future. And indeed, the definition, even the etymology of monument, it also implies the idea of admonishing something. In terms of your provocation, kitchen table monumentalism, if you can sum up that concept.
Yeah, so I mean, we were using that quite fast and loose, and kind of showing you stuff all over the place that isn't kind of fully formulated yet. But I guess what we were thinking about was in this relationship between the public and the private, about the temporality of the monument, like you were saying, you know, when is the monument? What does it commemorate? Is it something that's happened or something yet to come? And there are kind of historical precedents for that, and thinking about kind of revolutionary monuments that are celebrating a moment that isn't kind of yet completed. So we wanted to be able to envision that kind of taking of power rather than merely the toppling of the kind of power of the past. So there's a kind of temporal element, but there's also a spatial element. And we've talked about the kind of barrier, the division between the public and the private as a kind of spatial division. Mm-hmm. Once you concede that the historical public is foreclosed to you, you know, if we can't have the public squares, if we can't build Tatlin's monument however much we'd like to, we might have to work on a different scale. And, you know, the kind of DIY pearl monuments, those little kind of maquettes, become quite important as models in that, or the kind of feminist practice of making something in the kitchen, you know, while the baby naps. So we're kind of trying to look to those ideas of working within domestic space, within its constraints, to produce something that's DIY, that's portable, that can be posted by mail, but that becomes an image that's equally powerful to the kind of full-scale, you know, urban intervention. And if you think about it, Tatlin's monument was never built, but it exists precisely as documentation of a maquette. Yes. So we're kind of thinking about the maquette here when we talk about kitchen table monuments. Like, could we produce these kind of sculptural fictions that kind of anticipate a possible kind of retaking of the actual public space?
Definitely, that's brilliant. And we've got time for one more question. Does anybody have one last question? Let's see. Do let me know if I'm not, for some reason, if I'm missing somebody raising their hand. I was wondering whether Tanya, if you're still online, since you'll be our next speaker in this session, whether you might have a response to this. Sorry to put you on the spot there, Tanya.
No, I was exactly thinking today about a couple of questions which were raised. Also, I think very important was the importance of Tatlin, of, you know, a monumental structure which was meant as a building, an architectonical structure rather than a monument, but still also to the idea of a Russian Revolution. And still it was never built, but it had an enormous impact on the genre. And I thought today that maybe what could the future of monuments be, given the question on a Greta Thunberg monument, which will be inaugurated in Winchester now in March. But my idea was maybe we should have a monument over prevent the catastrophe, the climate catastrophe. And the journalist asked, yeah, but how would it look like? And I said, well, I'm not an artist, I don't have to know, but maybe we could turn around the function of a monument rather than commemorating past events which were horrific, like genocide or whatever. We could maybe use them to encourage a behavior that prevents a catastrophe. So I think in this way, it ties on to the ideas of today that taking a position of power also means to have a kind of ideology, not in this sense like the old times ideologies which we have seen, but to also provide ideas in the open space, to discuss them and to stimulate action, to change the course of history maybe.
Thank you for your kind of response. I think that's very useful. I think it's important for us to talk about the kind of impossibility of living without ideology. There always is ideology. So I think part of the problem with it not showing its face, as we've been suggesting, is that it's very difficult to then confront. And I think what art can do is not just kind of provide a visual, but also a narrative. So I think, you know, when we make visual art, it's also a narrative intervention. And I quite like the idea of, rather than merely averting the catastrophe, one trope that we've used a lot in our work is kind of derived from a quote by J.G. Ballard, who said, the catastrophe has already happened. And I like the idea that we live in, you know, catastrophic times, or even post-catastrophic times. And what's missing is the kind of understanding of the catastrophe. You know, it's like happened so fast that we've not really processed it. So there's something about producing the kind of retrospective, future speculative monument that looks back at the catastrophe that is still kind of unraveling, that I think is useful in kind of changing that conversation. So we often kind of resort to science fiction methodologies, because I think that's a good way of shedding a different light on the present.
Thank you so much, Galia and Pil. This was a brilliant session, and I encourage everybody to obviously explore Galia and Pil's work on their websites, on the different projects that they're doing. And thank you all for joining us today. Thank you for the question by Nick and Tanya. And so I just wanted to conclude today by saying that all these sessions, if you go back to our website for Creature, you will see all these sessions recorded in our past events. And so we are deliberately keeping an archive of all these sessions so that they can be used for future reference. And once again, to remind you that on the 22nd of April, there will be Tanya Schultz will be talking about this topic and will conclude the series for this year. And it's probably, something tells me that it will probably continue the series in the next year, because I think it just keeps evolving. We might give it a different spin, but this concept I don't think will ever leave us, and nor should it. You know, so it's great to see so many different perspectives on this. So of course there's plenty of other events, by the way. We're probably, you know, Creature and Cube were founded very recently, but they're very, very hectic you know, programs full of different activities. So do check both the centers out, and thank you very much for joining us. Thank you again, Galia and Phil, and that's a round of applause.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.